Now I want to carry on with examining the PHI1105W. Here we are in part 2, so we're still talking about PHI1105W. We're still talking about sensation, perception, still talking about judgment, still talking about it in the context of the third definition of knowledge, that is, knowledge as judgment, or episteme as doxa. If you recall, we had our master argument, which said that perception or aesthesis doesn't reach being and truth. So I put reach in scare quotes because I want to dig a little deeper into this notion of reaching being, the notion of perception and whatnot. And remember, from a previous video, I introduced this idea of a distinction between perception and sensation. Sensation is more like the raw feels. Perception is an examination of those, or a report, or a belief, or a judgment about those raw feels. In the sense of distinguishing between sensation and perception in this way, like a little diagram, perception is includes sensation, but it is more than that. So later on, we'll bring this distinction in to kind of drive it home. But let's, for the meantime, just work with the term perception, which we've seen is the translation of aesthesis. Now, I'm going to deviate a little bit from the text because I'm trying to pull out what I think is the logic that's under that sort of underscores this, or is, underpinning all this discussion. So let's look at a couple of propositions here. One I've indicated with an asterisk, the other with the dollar sign. Perception, we've seen, is claimed to be never false. And as I talked earlier on about, we want to be clear about, never giving unerring or not giving truth or whatever. We want to make sure that we're getting our distinctions nice and clear, because that, of course, is the game of philosophy. Is, as the great pragmatist Peirce said, it's a stubborn sort of effort to think clearly. It's to figure out your concepts and how they work together, how they fit together. So we're dealing with the concepts of perception and sensation, and I'm trying to pull them apart, yet show how they're related. So this is ultimately what we're working towards. But put that to the side for now, and let's just work with the term perception, aesthesis. So perception is never false, and perception always gives truth. You might think at first blush, well, isn't that the same thing? Right? Not never false and always giving truth. Isn't that the same thing? Well, not really. And what I want to show is just to motivate you to see them as different, not totally different, but related, but not identical. So remember, just because two concepts are not identical doesn't mean they're radically different or whatever, but, these two, perception and sensation, they're different, but they are related. So you want to be as subtle as you can, because the dialogue demands it, right? That we be subtle in our approach to concepts. All right, so if I follow this labeling, which is not in the dialogue, this is my labeling, a pedagogical, shall we say, methodology here, to try and make this a little clearer if I can. So perception is never false and always giving truth. These are not identical. You can move from, that is, you could say, well, if I start with perception first, always giving truth, right? I could move to the other one. If its perception is always giving truth, then it's not going to be false. That seems to be, it's giving me truth, so it's not going to be false. So that seems to make sense, because if you accept that it's always giving truth, right, then it's giving you the truth, so it's not going to give you falsity. That's more or less just repeating this, but I think the logic of that is fairly clear. It's the other one that might be a little bit unclear. That you can go from perception is never false to that it gives truth. Right? So if it's never false, then it must be giving you truth all the time. No, that's not the case. Why not? Well, remember that the asterisk says that perception never gives falsity. So I'm not introducing anything new, just saying this again. It never gives falsity, but it doesn't say what it gives. It just tells you what it doesn't give. Right? So what I'm saying here is that if it's not giving you something, so you can't say what it does give, all you could say is, well, I see that it doesn't give me something, then what does it give? I don't really know. So in that sense, you can think of a simple example. If I say, oh, Joe never eats ice cream, you can perfectly understand that, and you can also understand that, well, what does he eat? You don't know. I'm just telling you what he doesn't eat. Yeah, he never eats ice cream. Well, then what should I give him? Like, for or to make it a little bit, the example a little bit less artificial. For dessert, Joe never eats ice cream. I didn't tell you what he eats for dessert. Maybe he likes fruit or chocolate bars or whatever. It doesn't matter. But you don't know that. You just know, don't give him ice cream. He won't eat it. So same thing here. Perception won't give you falsity. Okay, but it doesn't. It just tells you what it won't give. It doesn't say what perception will actually give. That's a key thing to think about. What's something, when you characterize something by a negative, like what it doesn't, you can't immediately infer what it does, right? That's a fairly subtle point. You want to get your head around that. So just because it doesn't give you a falsity, that doesn't mean it gives you truth. To jump ahead a bit, mean it doesn't give you anything. That's really where we're headed. Okay, so Socrates seems to be after this, that perception doesn't give falsity or truth. In a modern version, we would say something like this. And this is not Plato's language, but philosophers, we've mulled over these concepts for centuries, that perception really doesn't have any cognitive content. It's just a raw feel. Right? So there's no cognition, there's no processing really going on. It's just a raw feel. And that's really what we tend to, in more modern philosophical terms, refer to as the distinction between perception and sensation. Perception is when you have the raw feel of sensation and some kind of doxa, some kind of calculation going on over top of it. But if you just have the sensation, that's a raw feel. That's no cognitive content. It might be connected to what is, but it doesn't tell you anything about what is. It doesn't even tell you that the raw feel is connected. It just is sort of connected without any processing of that connection. So you can think of it like this. Just here's another sort of a simple example. You might have seen this. This is the old Gestalt example, which is a German term for figure-ground relationships. And you may have seen the one where you have a vase and it looks like a vase if you look at it in one way, or it looks like two faces looking at each other, depending on what you regard as the ground and the figure. If you look at the central shape of as the figure and the background as the sides, you'll see a vase. But if you flip it, look at the central part as the background and the two sides as the figure, you'll see faces looking in. Have a look at that. Here's another version of a Gestalt one. The question is now, when you look at this, you have a raw sort of sensation. Now, most of you will see this as something, but just think of it, and we have to abstract to get to the sensation. You're all getting the same sensation, and then I say to you, is that a duck or a rabbit? Now, if you're having any trouble thinking about it, if it's a rabbit, he's looking at like a carrot over here. Right, so there he's looking at the carrot, right, and those are his ears. If it's a duck, well, maybe he's looking at the little, oh, that's terrible. Let's try this. Maybe he's looking at a fish or something. So rabbit looking that way, duck looking this way. Now what's interesting is this I'm going to use now the distinction. The raw sensation, you all have that, right? That's what we all get. But the sensation, when you add and go up to perception, what you're doing is bringing in a concept. And you're, as we say in the philosophy game, you're bringing a sensation under a concept. Sounds way fancier than it really is. You have the concept duck, and you have the concept rabbit. And so when you bring the concept of duck in, you change that sensation into a seeing, not just not just a simple sensation, but you get a perception out of the deal, which is, again, now we're talking about the doxa thing, belief or a judgment. So a more complex notion. You now see this as something. So when you say you see it as, you're taking a sensation and bringing it under a concept. You see it as a duck. You see it as a rabbit. Or, I don't know, maybe you can find something else you could see it as. So this is the beginning of real knowledge. This is another definition. So we're looking at saying, well, it's not just a raw feel, not just a simple sensation, and so aesthesis tends to be more connected with sensation, and it might have the beginning knowledge, or the beginning, shall we say, notion of a perception. But really, it's doxa when we're operating on these raw feels or natural perceptions or whatever you want to call them, that we start saying we're on the road to knowledge, because we're now linking it up with something from a raw feel and a conceptual element, like a concept, duck, rabbit. And it's nothing fancy here. This is how you start knowing things. Start, not necessarily that this is the finished definition of knowledge, but it certainly is much more involved than just raw sensations or raw feels. And what's interesting about this is that you can flip back and forth, right? You can, if I say see it as a duck or see it as a rabbit, you can flip back and forth on those things. So in that sense, you can think back to this master argument. What's really going on in there? Well, it's this early version of all this sensation, perception, gestalt stuff that Plato's talking about. When he says, do you see with or through the eye? Well, if you'd say about seeing with an eye, yeah, your eye gives you the sensation, right? That's the start. It just gives the beginning sensation, which is transmitted back into your brain, as we would say today, or eye given the sensation that's transmitted back to the soul, as Plato would say. But when you're really talking about seeing, you're not just talking about just the raw feel of the sensation. You're talking about the processing of it, the deeper notion of processing, which is more like perception, but onto the notion of acting on the sensation, which we will use the term judgment, belief, or doxa. Well, now you're bringing in a concept. So the soul, then Socrates says, well, you see through the eyes because it's an action of the soul. So that mysterious action of the soul we can think of it as bringing the sensation under a concept that's forming a belief or a judgment. So now we're in the realm of doxa. So we've made a step in the right direction. We've got something that's accurate. It doesn't give problems like your raw feels always give. They're unerring, but they don't give you error, but they don't give you truth either. Remember, the raw feels don't have any cognitive content. But knowledge is not just linked to being, it's also going to be linked to truth. And now here's why it runs into a bit of a problem, because if you just want to straightforwardly identify knowledge with belief, beliefs can be false, right? There can be all kinds of problems with beliefs. So judgments are not like these sensations. Judgments can be false. We have them all the time. So in order to flesh out this understanding now, we've got another problem. Well, if we're trying to link up being and truth with doxa, and it's got to be linked because we've said that knowledge has to be of that which is true, which exists and is true, then what do we do about the problem of false judgments? Because we can't just say knowledge is doxa, because if you say episteme is doxa, then you're in deep trouble, because episteme could then be false, and it can't be by definition. We've agreed. Well, at least Socrates has put that forward a long time ago. We've been operating under that assumption that it's linked, directly linked, not randomly, not haphazardly, but episteme is directly linked to truth. So how's this going to work? So what we're going to have to look at now is this notion of true belief and false belief. How does this all work? Right? So now we solve one little problem here, we kind of get a little bit of an advance, and now we raise another problem, which is the notion of how are false beliefs possible? How do we know when they are? And again, we still haven't clarified the exact relationship between episteme and doxa, because episteme has to be linked to truth, and doxa, yeah, it can be, but it's not necessarily linked to truth. So how is this all going to play out? So Socrates says, well, my dear Theaetetus, we indeed are are digging deeper into this. We've made some progress. We've come a long ways because we think that episteme, we've got some properties of it. We've ruled out a main, shall we say, candidate for the notion of episteme. That is aesthesis and that sort of raw feels kind of thing. That's not going to be the whole story. It's not going to be eliminated from the story, so it's part of the story. We've got now, in addition to that, this notion of doxa, so the soul operating on the raw feels that are coming in, seeing through the eyes, not with. But now what are false beliefs? How does this work? And Socrates says, well, my dear Theaetetus, it's time to consider the notion of false belief. And again, remember, philosophers are, shall we say, the soul is at leisure. We philosophers think about things leisurely. We're not tied down to the water clock like the lawyers. We've gone through that. Philosophers look at things leisurely. So let us follow Socrates as he examines the notion of what is a doxa that's false. How is that possible? So to get a better understanding of doxa that are true, we need to have an understanding of when they go awry, when they're false. And so we have to go and examine, to go back to our early metaphor, of whether or not this whole process that we've got into is going to be a fertile offspring, or remember, or if it's just going to be another one of those wind eggs and we got to get rid of it. So on to false doxa. See you next video.